The morning of the wedding was the kind of morning that makes people believe the world is good. The sky was clear and pale blue. The sun came up slowly over the Harrington estate, warming the stone walls and the white roses that had been arranged along every path and archway. Cars arrived one after another. Guests stepped out in their best clothes, laughing and greeting each other with hugs and loud voices. It was a beautiful day, and everyone there knew it. Naomi Carter arrived alone. She stepped out of a black car and stood still for a moment, looking at the estate. She was 43 years old. She wore a deep green dress that fit her well, and her hair was neat and pinned back. She held a small clutch bag in both hands and checked the invitation card one more time, even though she already knew the details by heart. She had read it many times over the past 2 weeks, not because she was confused, but because she kept asking herself whether she should actually go. She had decided to go. She walked through the main entrance and joined the flow of guests moving toward the ceremony garden. A bridesmaid stood at the door handing out programs. She handed one to the couple in front of Naomi. She handed one to the men behind Naomi. She looked past Naomi entirely and turned to speak to another bridesmaid. Naomi quietly picked up a program from the pile on the table nearby and kept walking. She found her seat near the back, in the last row of white chairs. She sat down, placed her bag on her lap, and looked around. Families were finding their seats. Old friends were leaning across chairs to catch up. Children were being hushed by parents. Everyone seemed to know someone. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere. Naomi watched all of this and said nothing. She was used to watching. The ceremony was lovely. The garden had been decorated with hanging lanterns and long tables of flowers in soft pink and white. When the bride, Claire, appeared at the end of the aisle, many guests turned and whispered to each other. She was stunning, calm and glowing, moving slowly and deliberately toward the men waiting at the front. Marcus Webb stood at the altar looking like a man who could not believe his luck. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a deep navy suit, and when he saw Claire walking toward him, his eyes became wet and he looked away for just a moment to collect himself. Naomi watched him do that. She smiled quietly to herself. She had known Marcus since he was 7 years old. Back then, he had been a small, thin boy with big eyes and 2 large shoes. He used to knock on her door on Saturday mornings and ask if she needed help carrying groceries from the car. He never asked for anything in return. He just liked to help. He was that kind of child, the kind that makes you believe there is still something right with the world. The vows were read. The rings were exchanged. When the officiant told Marcus he could kiss his bride, the entire garden erupted in applause and laughter. Naomi clapped too, and she meant it. The reception was held inside the main ballroom of the estate. It was a large and beautiful room, with high ceilings and warm lighting and round tables dressed in cream linen. A band played soft music near the far wall. Waitstaff moved through the room with trays of drinks and small appetizers. Naomi was seated at a table near the side wall. Her table companions were 3 cousins of the groom, 2 women and 1 man, who introduced themselves at the start of dinner, asked her name and how she knew the couple, and then turned their chairs slightly inward and continued their own conversation for the rest of the meal. It was not aggressive. It was not deliberate, or at least it did not feel deliberate. It was simply the natural closing of a circle that she was not part of. She ate her meal slowly and listened to the band and watched the room. During cocktail hour, before dinner was served, she had tried twice to join conversations. The first time, she approached a small group near the flower display and smiled and introduced herself. They nodded and smiled back, and one woman asked politely where she was from. When Naomi answered, the woman nodded again and then turned to address someone else in the group, and the conversation moved on without her. The second time went similarly. After that, Naomi found a spot near the tall windows that looked out over the garden and stood there with her glass of water, watching the light change outside as the afternoon shifted toward evening. A teenager sat down in the chair closest to the window. She had dark curly hair and her shoes were clearly hurting her because she pulled them off and tucked her feet underneath her on the chair. She looked up at Naomi and said, without any preamble, that she hated formal events. Naomi laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes without warning. She told the girl she agreed. The girl's name was Sophie. She was 15, the daughter of Marcus's older sister, and she had been at 3 weddings that year because apparently everyone in the family decided to get married at the same time, which she found deeply inconvenient. Naomi told her that sounded exhausting. Sophie said it was. They talked for 20 minutes, about school, and about music and about whether the food at this wedding was better or worse than the food at the other 2. Sophie talked mostly and Naomi listened and responded, and it was the most comfortable 20 minutes Naomi had spent all day. Then Sophie's mother called her over, and she was gone, slipping her shoes back on with a small grimace as she went. Naomi watched her leave and then turned back to the window. Dinner was served and the room grew louder and warmer. The band played softly under the noise of conversation and cutlery and glasses being refilled. Naomi ate her meal and did not try to join the table conversation again. She was tired, not physically, but in a particular way that comes from spending hours being unseen in a crowded room. It is a specific kind of tiredness. It sits in the chest and makes everything feel heavier. She had almost decided to leave quietly after dinner. She would find Marcus later, she told herself. She would call or write a card. She did not need to stay. She had come, and she had seen him married, and that was enough. But then the speeches began. The best man went first. He was Marcus's oldest friend, a broad, cheerful man named Derek, who told 3 funny stories and 1 genuinely moving one. The room laughed and then went quiet and then laughed again. He was good at it. Claire's maid of honor went next. She had known Claire since they were 9 years old, and she cried twice during her speech and made the whole room cry with her. Even Naomi, at her table by the wall, felt her eyes grow warm. Then Marcus stood up. The room settled. He took the microphone from the stand and held it with both hands for a moment, looking at his notes. Then he put the notes face down on the table and spoke without them. He thanked his parents. He thanked Claire's parents. He thanked the guests for coming from near and far. He said some things about Claire that were personal and true and made her press her hand to her heart and look at him with full eyes. He was good with words, not fancy words, but honest ones. People listened. Then he paused. It was a real pause. Long enough for people to notice. Long enough for the energy in the room to shift slightly, the way a breeze changes just before rain. He said, "Before I finish, I want to introduce someone." The room waited. "There is a woman here tonight," he said, "who most of you have not spoken to today. I noticed that. I have been noticing it all evening. And I want to correct that right now, because this woman deserves to be known by every single person in this room." He looked toward the back of the ballroom. "Her name is Naomi Carter." Every head turned. Naomi went very still. She felt the weight of 200 eyes finding her face, and she sat straight and kept her expression calm, though her heart was beating fast. Marcus continued. His voice was steady and clear. "When I was 7 years old," he said, "my family went through a very difficult time. My parents were separating. There were money problems. My sister and I were moved from place to place, staying with different relatives, and for one full winter, I was 8 by then, we were in a situation where things were genuinely hard. I mean hard in ways that children should not have to understand." The room was completely silent. "Our neighbor," he said, "was a woman named Naomi Carter. She was a single mother. She worked 2 jobs. She had her own responsibilities, her own challenges, more than enough reason to mind her own business and close her own door. But she did not do that. She noticed 2 kids who were not being looked after properly, and she acted. She made sure we had food. She made sure we had what we needed for school. She sat with us when we were scared. She never made a big deal of it. She never asked for anything back. She simply showed up, again and again, for 2 kids who were not her own. Someone at a table near the front made a soft sound, not a word, just a breath. I grew up," Marcus said. "I went to school. I became an architect. I built a good life. And through all of it, Naomi Carter never asked me to remember what she did. She never reminded me. She never called and said, 'Marcus, do you remember what I gave you?' She just lived her life. She is that kind of person." He stopped for a moment and looked toward where Naomi was sitting. "But I remember," he said. "I have always remembered. And the reason I invited her here today, to my wedding, the most important day of my life, is because I wanted her to know that the things you do for people matter. Even when no one sees them. Even when no one says thank you. Even when years go by. They matter. You mattered. You matter. The silence in the room lasted 3 full seconds. Then it broke, not all at once, but in pieces, like ice cracking in spring. Someone started clapping and then others followed, and within a few seconds the entire room was on its feet. Naomi sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the table in front of her. She was not going to cry. She had decided, some years ago, that she was finished crying over things that should have been simple human decency. But her eyes were bright, and her jaw was tight, and she breathed slowly through her nose to keep herself steady. She became aware of movement near her table. She looked up. Claire, the bride, was walking toward her. She was still in her wedding dress, moving carefully between the tables, coming directly and deliberately to where Naomi was sitting. She stopped beside Naomi's chair and extended her hand, not a formal handshake, but a real reaching out, palm open. She said, "Will you come and sit with us?" Naomi looked at her hand. She looked at her face. Claire's expression was open and warm and completely sincere. There was no performance in it. She meant it. Naomi stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress, the same small gesture she had made when she arrived at the estate that morning. Then she took Claire's hand. The room watched as they walked together from the back table toward the front. The applause had settled into a warm quiet. People shifted in their seats. Marcus's mother, a small woman in a gray dress who had not spoken to Naomi once that day, sat with both hands pressed flat on the table in front of her and watched them come. Her face held something that was hard to name, not quite shame, not quite grief, but something that lived between them. The bridesmaid who had handed out programs at the door, the one who had looked past Naomi at the entrance, stood near the side of the room with her arms crossed tightly and her eyes down. Sophie, from across the room, caught Naomi's eye. She raised both hands above her head and clapped. It was young and sincere and a little awkward, and it made Naomi almost smile. Almost. A chair was brought to the head table. Marcus pulled it out himself and waited. Naomi sat down. She set her small bag on the table. She looked out at the room, all the faces turned toward her, some moved, some uncertain, all of them finally seeing her, and she held their gaze without flinching. Marcus crouched down beside her chair so they were at eye level. He said, quietly, so that only she could hear, "Thank you for coming." Naomi said, "You were a good boy, Marcus. I always knew you would be a good man." He nodded. He stood up. He raised his glass toward her, and the room raised their glasses too, and someone near the front said her name softly, like a word they were learning to pronounce correctly for the first time. The band began to play again. The room gradually returned to the warmth and noise of celebration. Conversation started up. Glasses were refilled. The dance floor began to fill. Naomi sat at the head table and ate a piece of wedding cake that a waiter brought her without being asked. It was good, vanilla with a lemon filling, not too sweet. She drank a glass of champagne slowly. She watched Marcus lead Claire onto the dance floor for their first dance, and she watched how they moved together, easy and close, like two people who had already decided to trust each other completely. Sophie appeared at her elbow at some point during the evening and sat in the empty chair beside her and told her that Marcus had cried during the rehearsal dinner when he talked about her, which was embarrassing but also very sweet. Naomi told her it sounded very much like him. Sophie agreed. Later, when the evening had stretched long and the older guests were starting to say their goodbyes, Naomi stood and collected her bag. She found Marcus and Claire near the door, thanking people as they left. When he saw her coming, he stepped forward and held both of her hands in his. She told him it was a beautiful wedding. She told him she was very happy for him. She told him Claire seemed like someone worth building a life with. Marcus said, "She is." Naomi nodded. She said good night. She walked out through the main door of the estate, past the white roses and the lanterns that were still glowing softly in the dark, and she got into a black car and drove away. On the ride home, she looked out the window at the lights of the city passing by. She thought about the boy with the two large shoes who used to knock on her door on Saturday mornings. She thought about how small and quiet those years had been, the extra portions of food, the school supplies left on the doorstep, the times she had sat with him and his sister in her living room while they slept on her couch, safe and warm and fed. She had never thought of those things as remarkable. They were simply what a person does when they see someone in need. That was all. But Marcus had remembered. After all these years, and all the distance between that cold winter and this warm, glowing night, he had remembered. He had said her name out loud in a room full of people who did not know it, and he had made them learn it. That, she decided, was enough. More than enough. She leaned her head against the cool glass of the car window and closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt completely at rest.